Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise to speak to Bill 47, Housing Statutes Transit-Oriented Development Amendment Act 2023. The proposed legislation is aimed at encouraging communities to build housing in areas that it is calling transit hubs. And to achieve this, it is to encourage local governments to bring in transit-oriented developments in their official community plans. So TODs, transit-oriented developments, and OCPs, official community plans. For those that don't currently, those local governments that don't currently have TODs, Bill 47 requires the municipalities to designate these areas. And those that have existing transit-oriented development areas those will take effect right away. Local governments will have until the end of June to establish transit-oriented development areas by bylaw, and if they don't do that, the provincial government can step in. I support communities that are more vibrant, more resilient, with easy access to transit and amenities. Just listening to my colleague from West Vancouver Sea to Sky talking about snowy areas and the need for parking. I spent my childhood and part of my young adulthood in a very snowy city, Edmonton, Alberta, without a car, and relied very heavily on transit to get along, to get around, and learned how to wrap up my skin so that I would not suffer from frostbite or exposure walking through those snowy streets. And it is entirely possible in cities with effective transit to get around without vehicles. And we should be really orienting ourselves towards creating the ability and the choice for people to have to get around with transit regardless of where they live in this province. We often hear the shorthand for these vibrant, connected, resilient communities with easy access to transit and amenities being described as 15-minute cities, the idea that you could walk or cycle anywhere within your community within 15 minutes and have access to all the amenities that you need, your work, your recreation, your services, parks. And when you think about the sort of global destinations that people like to travel to, often where they like to travel are to cities and regions that are highly walkable, that have large parts of their cities that don't have access to vehicles, that are very transit heavy. There's, for example, Copenhagen in Denmark. And several decades ago, Copenhagen decided to close off the entire core of its city to vehicles. And when I was there, it's been a while now, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it was such a delightful city to spend time in because I had my young son with me at the time, we could ride our bikes feeling very safe, there was transit accessible everywhere, and you were part of this very vibrant community of people that gathered all times of the day, and really enjoyed that outside life that is offered when there aren't vehicles whizzing by at every moment. Barcelona has an extensive part of the town that is non-accessible to vehicles. Seville in Spain as well. Just extraordinary. Whole center of town is only for pedestrians. And these are places that people like to travel to because it's great to be a part of that feeling of being in a community where you're not constantly having to dodge cars whizzing past you, that you're part of the human community and that pure joy that comes from just being able to interact with people on the street. We know from research and studies that talking to strangers is good for our mental health, for example. And when we have communities that are designed with lots of public spaces and lots of capacity for us to interact with each other when we're riding on the bus or waiting at a bus stop or walking down a street with no traffic on it, we get to enjoy the benefits of those interactions. And we should absolutely be orienting our efforts towards creating more and more communities that have this kind of resiliency and vibrancy right at the center of them. This is also a significant part of our efforts to combat climate change, which is a part of the debate in this House right now. And, you know, I think that when we look at how we respond to climate change, we have to ask ourselves, where are humans in our climate change plan, and where is nature in our climate change plan? And those two things are largely lacking from the current plan we have in BC. But creating the conditions where people don't have to rely on vehicles to get the amenities that they need, where they can walk to school, where they can walk to work or cycle, these create the conditions for all of us to be able to reduce our emissions individually, but more importantly, collectively. To suggest to people you just have to find a way to not use your vehicle, but without having access to available, accessible, affordable transit, reliable transit, or without having access to the kind of cycling infrastructure that we see in Victoria, it's very hard for people to make that decision to not use their vehicle. And so this is the way to create the collective impacts that we want from making sure that people individually can make those choices. North America has been the poster child in design that favors cars and highways. And I have a stepsister who lives in California, and we went and visited her a few years ago. And it's quite astonishing to see a state that really only has infrastructure for vehicles. We really had no choice but to use a vehicle when we were there. And the highways of highways in California is something that I think all of us should look at and think, we do not want that. That is the wrong direction. And a kind of centrality of the car. I had an artist friend who once said if aliens were to look down on North America, they would be pretty certain that the cars were the beings that the humans were serving. That we got the cars to where they wanted to go and put them safely into nice little shelters at night and washed them and filled them up with fuel. And we take very good care of those, but we actually want to create communities and ideally a province in the future where cars are not at the center of everything we do. Real estate has historically given homeowners great long-term returns that they've been able to pass down to future generations, and this is one of the reasons Canadians still believe it's one of the best investments they could make. However, and I think much of the debate that's happening in all of the houses at the moment in this legislature is around whether a home is more than just a commodity. Is it more than just an investment? And I think most of us agree that a home is something much greater than a commodity or an investment. But we have to ask ourselves, how are we responding to the situation we're in now, where that affordability of that home, of that dwelling, has become out of reach for far too many people. If we want to make strides towards sustainable long-term affordability and livability, we really must use existing land more pragmatically, and we must create cities, towns, and neighborhoods that offer a mix of housing types with a vision for quality of life and equity in access to that quality of life at the forefront. I am in favor of transit-oriented development that is intended in Bill 47, and yet I have some questions about this legislation and how it will roll out and affect local governments. Cities such as Helsinki, as another example, have captured the spirit of the 15-minute framework and even surpassed it by ensuring that each neighborhood has a balance of market housing, mixed income housing, and non-market subsidized housing. This last piece is what is largely being ignored in our conversations in BC and Canada when it comes to the housing affordability crisis. It's not just how it is a housing affordability crisis. And unless we have non-market housing as part of a significant part of our housing mix, we are going to find ourselves in this perpetual cycle of the housing affordability crisis. the mix offers residents access to a culturally and socially economic, diverse, vibrant community where small businesses and people thrive. This is what we could have across BC, but unfortunately, there's not much in Bill 47 that we see that supports this vision. The Minister of Transportation said he has earmarked $400 million to acquire land around future SkyTrain terminals and transit hubs, which will give government first crack at developing affordable housing in those key locations, rather than leaving it to private speculators to build expensive condos. But the province's track record on delivering affordable housing is not very good. Market rents are hitting record highs in Canada, with Vancouver leading the way. An average one-bedroom in August in Vancouver went for over $3,000 a month. Non-market housing, as offered by nonprofits and public agencies, is in greater need than ever before, and the lack of investment for decades, particularly from the federal government starting in the 1990s, has really created a massive, massive deficit of non-market, truly affordable housing. From what I understand, the province is still trying to figure out how to approach building affordable housing near transit. They're working with BC Housing on how that gets programmed, and they've committed up to 10,000 units, but haven't advanced anything, and there is no concrete plan that British Columbians can look at or a timeline. How will British Columbians be assured that government will deliver this non-market housing? How will this government continue to rely, or how much will this government continue to rely on the private sector to build what they call affordable housing and which hasn't been delivered? The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives released a report last month that demonstrates how governments should focus less on fruitless incentives to the private sector and more on direct spending on non-market affordable housing. BC does indeed need more housing inventory, but the solution is not just about boosting supply. We need purposeful inventory, the right type of housing in the right areas with access to the right mix of transportation, and most importantly, with livability at the core. This should be prioritized in all communities across the province, but especially in smaller markets that are on the cusp of very fast growth. There are human costs to the kind of sprawl that we see in North America. A recent study by TomTom revealed that Canadians spent approximately 144 hours in rush hour traffic across the country in 2022. Despite suburbia offering pockets of affordability and promising improved livability, this perceived appeal quickly becomes diluted with commute times. There are also environmental impacts on the wrong kinds of development. Only over 7% of the original wetlands in the Lower Fraser Valley and parts of Vancouver Island have disappeared. And an 85% wetland loss has been reported in the South Okanagan due to urban sprawl. Right now, approximately 10% of Canada's housing market is at risk of a 1 in 100-year flood event that has been classified as essentially uninsurable. That number will only increase as we continue to build homes in floodplains, and if we don't fix our diversified infrastructure, said Catherine Bakos, Director of Climate Finance and Science at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Other questions that we have with this legislation is how will these changes be received by local governments? How are municipalities being supported to do all the heavy lifting that Bills 44, 46, and 47 require? And how will the government ensure their numerous policy manuals for these pieces of housing legislation are accessible and that they truly support the work of local governments in updating their bylaws and OCPs, and as they communicate these changes to developers and the public and countless other impacted stakeholders? How does the government feel about downloading so much responsibility onto already significantly overburdened local governments? It's unclear to me how Bill 44 and the removal of public hearings for development that fit within a community's OCP applies to this bill. And while I support reforming the public hearing process, I worry that people across BC will feel increasingly left out and increasingly less trusting. Pushback against the ideas, for example, of 15-minute cities happens when residents are not included in conversations about the future and are relying on information being provided to them by sources that are not necessarily reliable because they are not getting reliable information from their public institutions and their governments. If people can't see themselves in this future, that creates an environment of distrust. And what people fear about these ideas is that they're not part of the planning processes. And what we're seeing with the legislation that's in front of this House right now is a potential acceleration of that feeling of dislocation, being left out of processes, being left out of planning, and unfortunately, an increase in distrust, which is the opposite direction we need to go right now as a province and as a democracy. We are supportive of building housing near transit. However, we are also concerned about transit infrastructure in this province. I have been asking for years to have better transit between Cowichan Valley and the Capital Regional District, where tens of thousands of vehicles go over the Malahat Highway every single day with very limited access to transit, only a handful of buses going south in the morning, a handful of buses going north in the evening, and each way costing $10 for a trip. This is neither accessible nor affordable transit, and it does nothing to solve the congestion that we see growing every single week on the Trans-Canada Highway coming over the Malahat and into the Capital Regional District. Mayor Brad West, the chair of the Mayor's Council, stated, quote, "The fact is you can't have transit-oriented development without transit. And TransLink's current system is unable to keep up with the growing public demand for services across this region." A similar call for funding was echoed at the local level by Anita Huberman, CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade. She said, quote, "These regulations will help guide local governments in making responsible urban development decisions that prioritize transit access and minimize environmental impacts. We urge the BC government to ensure there's adequate funding for enhanced transit services in Surrey. We believe we need the government and the province to rapidly increase public transit services across this province. I think all of us hear from constituents in every part of this province about the lack of access to public transit, and particularly for an aging population who have to travel in rural and remote areas to access healthcare. When they don't have access to public transit, it makes that travel extremely difficult for people. The province has absolutely fallen behind on transit infrastructure. I looked at a map not that long ago of the Greyhound service that used to exist in British Columbia in the 1970s and the 1980s. You could get anywhere on a Greyhound. I often did. I'd moved here when I was 20, and to get back to Alberta for Christmas holidays, I would take a Greyhound. It was a reliable and affordable form of transportation that existed that no longer exists in this province. And as we saw in the British reality travel program not that long ago, there was quite a bit of shock and surprise, people visiting Vancouver Island to discover you actually pretty much can't get around this island or get up this island using public transit because it doesn't exist. And to think that we are here in 2023 and the options available to people for public transit in between our communities are low to none. It's a pretty shocking state of affairs. Last year we were in the interior, having a little family break. And my son asked Google the different ways to get back from Kelowna to Vancouver, and Google let him know that he could cycle more quickly than he could get there by transit in January. We have a problem. We have a transit deficit problem in this province. The TransLink Mayor's Council, the group tasked with overseeing TransLink strategic direction, and we think of Lower Mainland, there's transit available, but even there is a deficit. The group tasked with overseeing TransLink strategic direction and priorities have created a 10-year plan that would cost $20 billion. However, TransLink faces a long-term funding problem. Research shows that BC is a hotbed for profit-driven displacement. In a report for the Balanced Supply of Housing Project at UBC, Silas Zureb and Craig Jones show that British Columbia has significantly higher rates of evictions than the rest of the country, and that 85% of the province's evictions are no-fault evictions. The report attributes the prevalence of these evictions to pressures around profit-driven displacement, where the financial incentives of selling a property or raising rents lead landlords to evict tenants from their homes, despite these tenants paying rent and respecting the property. An interim report from First United's BC's eviction mapping project also confirms the prevalence of these forms of profit-driven displacement. This report further notes the disproportionate effects of this kind of displacement on Indigenous, racialized, and disabled members of the community, a significant portion of whom are evicted into homelessness. There is no resolution to the housing affordability crisis that does not involve putting an end to profit-driven displacement. To hold otherwise risks perpetuating injustices rather than remedying them. To genuinely address the problem of a profit-driven displacement, we should engage with what Olufemi Otaiwo refers to as constructive politics, which would move beyond performative consultation or tokenistic representation in housing politics. A constructive housing politics would aim to share decision-making power with those who lack adequate housing, including those who have been displaced or who are at risk of displacement, and to strive together to alleviate housing insecurity and deprivation in concrete and meaningful ways. Much of what will unfold in this legislation, as has become more and more common in this House, will come in regulation, including the definition of exchange. And there remain a lot of questions about how this bill will work in conversation with Bills 44 and 46. And as has been raised several times, the number of housing bills currently being debated simultaneously in this House makes it very difficult for the members of the Legislative Assembly as well as the public to get a full and complete picture on what's happening or the intention of what this government wants to have happen from all of these pieces of legislation. And so with that, I will end my comments and move over to the next chamber to find out what's happening there. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Thank you, Member.